In this video you will learn a universal and very simple system to play against the Sicilian defense. After the move e4. One of the best and most frequent responses from black is c5, the Sicilian defense. The Sicilian defense is one of the best defenses for black. It usually leads to very sharp positions in which black has very good winning chances. It is a very difficult defense to break, and white usually has a lot of difficulties fighting against this dynamic defense. Therefore, in this video you will learn a very simple system to play that will allow you to successfully face the Sicilian defense. Now, white can play knight f3, developing his king's knight on its natural square and taking control of the d4 square, with the idea of preparing the d4 move and occupying the center with his pawns. Now, in the event of any response from black, white can play bishop d3, developing his king's bishop and preparing to castle. The bishop blocks the passage of the queen's pawn, but this is not serious, since white's plan is to continue with c3 and bishop c2, removing the bishop and allowing the queen's pawn to advance. The c3 move is a very useful move, since it will limit the mobility of a black knight on c6 and, at the same time, support the d4 move. For example, in case of d6, white plays bishop d3. The idea is to quickly develop the kingside and castle. Then white can play c3 to retreat the bishop to the c2 square. The plans will be similar to the king's Indian attack, but with the bishop placed on c2, where it will be better placed than on g2, since from c2 it points directly towards the kingside. In addition, the c3 pawn will limit the mobility of a black knight on c6 and support the occupation of the center with d4. The advantage of this system of play is that it eliminates any home preparation by black and transforms the typical Sicilian position with very sharp positions into a calmer position, similar to the Spanish opening. It leads the sharp Sicilian player into a positional type of struggle, not unlike the Ruy Lopez. If black now plays knight f6, white can play c3, continuing with his plans. After, for example, knight c6. Bishop c2. If black plays e5, white can play h3, taking control of the g4 square, with the idea of being able to attack in the center with d4. If black develops his king's bishop on the e7 square, a type of position similar to the Ruy Lopez opening will be reached. White can castle short. He can occupy the center with d4 or leave his pawn on d3 and perform the typical maneuver with his queen's knight d2, f1, e3, or g3. If black plays g6, with the idea of developing his king's bishop by fianchetto, white can play d4, occupying the center with his pawns. In case of bishop g7, white can play d takes c5, with the idea of reaching a favorable endgame. After d takes c5, white exchanges queens and black is forced to lose castling, as he cannot recapture with the knight since he has to keep defending the e5 pawn. After king takes d8, white can continue with bishop e3, knight a3 to go to the c4 square to attack the e5 pawn. White has very good winning chances. After the move bishop to d3, black can play knight c6. White plays c3, continuing with his plans. Black can play g6, with the idea of developing his king's bishop by fianchetto. White plays bishop c2, retreating his bishop and freeing the way for the queen's pawn. After bishop g7, white can castle. Black can play knight f6, developing his king's knight and preparing to castle. White can play h3, taking control of the g4 square so that he can then attack in the center with d4. Black can castle. From here we will follow a masterful game in which we will be able to see the typical plans. Now white played d4, occupying the center with his pawns. Black played c takes d4, eliminating the opponent's central pawn. After c takes d4. If black now plays knight b4, attacking the enemy bishop, with the idea of diverting him from defending the e4 pawn, white can play bishop b3 to keep the bishop. Now, it would be a mistake to capture the pawn, since after knight takes e4, white plays queen e1 attacking both opposing knights and white wins. If black plays e5, white can advance with d5 to gain space in the center, or he can exchange pawns with d takes e5. After d takes e5, white plays knight c3 and will be able to take advantage of the d5 square with his pieces. The bishop on g7 is passive and white has very good play. After the move c takes d4, black played d5. White replied e5, gaining space in the center and attacking the knight on f6. The game continued with knight to e8. White played knight c3, developing his queen's knight. Black played knight c7, trying to activate his knight. White played rook e1, activating his king's rook and reinforcing the defense of the e5 pawn, which is a strategically very important point. Black played b6 with the idea of developing his queen's bishop on the a6 square. White played bishop e3, completing the development of his minor pieces. Black played bishop a6, completing the development of his minor pieces and placing his bishop on a good diagonal. White played rook c1, putting his queen's rook into play, occupying the c-file, which is an open file. Black played rook c8, activating his queen's rook, occupying the c-file, with the idea of opposing the action of the enemy rook. Now, white played h4, with the idea of attacking on the kingside. Now, if black plays h5, to stop the advance of the enemy pawn. White can play knight g5, placing the knight on a good square near the enemy's castling. White exerts a lot of pressure and has an advantage. In the game, after the move h4, black played knight b5, with the idea of attacking on the queenside and trying to obtain counterplay. The threat is to capture on c3, to create weaknesses in the opponent's pawn structure. White played knight takes b5. After bishop takes b5. White played h5, continuing his attack on the kingside. Black played e6, connecting his pawns to reinforce his central structure. White played h takes g6, with the idea of destroying the opponent's king's defenses and opening lines for attack. If black captures with the h-pawn, white can play bishop g5, followed by queen d2, with the idea of invading with his pieces through the weak squares in the enemy's castling. White will be able to organize a decisive attack. In the game after the capture on g6, black recaptured with the f-file pawn, to try to activate his rook. White played knight g5, attacking the e6 pawn. Black played queen e7, mobilizing his queen to defend the e6 pawn and at the same time connecting the rooks. Now, the strongest move for white was knight takes h7, sacrificing the knight to completely destroy the opponent's king's defenses. White would win, since he is threatening to capture the f8 rook, and it would not be possible to capture the knight with king takes h7. Since white plays queen h5 check, taking advantage of the pin. After king g8, white plays bishop takes g6, threatening queen h7, which would be checkmate. After bishop h8 to defend the 7th rank with his queen and avoid checkmate. White plays bishop g5, threatening to capture the opponent's queen and incorporating the bishop into the attack. White can continue with rook c3, to move the rook to the kingside and have a decisive attack. In the game after the move queen e7, white played queen g4, moving his queen to the kingside to incorporate it into the attack. The immediate threat is to capture the e6 pawn. Black played knight b4, attacking the bishop on c2 and trying to get counterplay. But white played bishop b1 and black finally resigned. For example, in case of bishop d7 to reinforce the defense of the e6 pawn. White would play knight takes h7, sacrificing the knight. After king takes h7. White plays queen takes g6 check. After king g8. White plays queen h7 check. And after king f7. Bishop g6 is checkmate. A very instructive game in which we have seen a very simple and easy to play system that will allow you to fight against the Sicilian defense without having to learn theory.